Would you believe me if I told you that Guru Nanak Dev Ji referred to themselves as a poet, and yet almost all translations have stripped away the beauty and meaning of those words?
Poetry is what separates kind of the beast from the man.
Today we're sitting down once again with Dr Jvala Singh, the mind behind a brand new course on Jap Ji Sahib. Among the many questions we explore, we ask, what did we lose when colonial translators flattened Sikh scripture into plain prose? Now, with that out of the way, let's get into it. So the first module was obviously Sikh history. This new module is going to be Jap Ji Sahib. Why do you think it's important to have covered the topics you've covered in the order that you've covered them, if that makes sense?
Like you're asking basically, why am I doing now Jap Ji Sahib?
Why start? Yeah, why start, for argument's sake, with Sikh history and then go to Jap Ji Sahib rather than, for argument's sake, I don't know. Like, as in, for a lot of the courses that I think you'll find out on the internet either deal with history or with scripture or philosophy, I guess. What I find interesting with this is you started with history, but then have moved on to like the foundational text of Sikhi. Why do you think teaching students in that order is important?
I think getting them kind of situated within the timeline kind of historically helps to kind of see the development of the tradition. And I think something like reading through Jap Ji Sahib, which is, I would say, and I think a lot of commentators say this as well, Jap Ji Sahib, I think, is the most complicated composition in Guru Granth Sahib. And we're not starting with the hardest, but I think, as in to say, we're not going at the depth of, as deep as you can go in this course. I don't want to scare people away from this course, but it does help to have done SS 101 first to kind of get a broad overview of the Sikh tradition across time, right? Because this is looking specifically at this composition, the conversation that Guru Nanak is having with many different groups, not only the Siddhas, the yogis at the time, but also devotional groups at that time, Vaishnava communities, and also the Advaita, or let's say the non-dualistic schools of thought at this time as well, right? And these are the conversations that come out in Jap Ji Sahib. So to kind of begin that discussion, to look at that, it does help to have a broad overview of what the Sikh tradition is, what are key elements in the tradition, thinking through devotion, thinking through seva, these kind of commonly understood. If you're part of the Sikh community, you will know like seva is really important. But what does that mean outside of going to the Gurdwara and then kind of helping, distributing the dal, right? Like, what is seva in a very broad sense? What is bhakti or devotion in a very broad sense? Those elements help then kind of situate the student within this landscape. And now we're going to kind of go deeper into, actual composition, from start to finish. This is like a reading course. So that's why this is like a 200 level course. It is a little bit more complicated in the sense of you're going to do a little bit more reading of the Jap Ji Sahib, of the composition itself, various translations, but it's more focused. It's not as broad.
With Jap Ji Sahib, most people will have an idea of it as being a part of scripture or a bit of their prayer or however you want to word it. And I think a lot of people are, when they read it, aren't necessarily aware that it's poetry. Now, I guess, why is Gurbani written in poetry in the first place? But then you also make a claim that it's not just devotional poetry. So what are the layers to poetry perhaps that we're just not aware of? And how are those layers incorporated within Gurbani? And I guess, how are you going to pick them out? Because I think for a lot of people, they may view Jap Ji Sahib or Gurbani as being more kind of dogmatic or kind of instructional in terms of this is what you should do in order to achieve X, Y, or Z.
This is one of the reasons actually I wanted to do this course, and one of the problems that this course is trying to solve, in that when we look at Jap Ji Sahib today, and I would say most of the course here is designed for those people who cannot really read the old commentaries, or if they can read the old commentaries, and I'm talking from the 19th century, 18th century, they don't know how to engage with them in a way that is going to be really beneficial. They might feel that with all of these commentaries, they don't know where to start. they were kind of drowned in all that information, right? It really helps to have a teacher kind of curate that information, kind of draw out the main concepts, etc. So when reading Jap Ji Sahib today, most people just are relying on English translations, right? And the English translations then kind of flatten the text. And what I mean by that is they don't bring to light, because it's in a different language as well, they don't bring to light kind of the poetic devices, the alliteration, all of the elements of poetry that make that composition what it is, that make it so kind of striking to a reader, to a listener, right? And poetry, when you kind of when you kind of remove Japji Sahib from its poetic uh, structure, um, and from the perspective, like from the experience, when you're removing yourself from that kind of framework, what happens is you begin to read Jap Ji Sahib, like you were saying, kind of like, okay, it's telling me this, I should do this, kind of commandment, um, and in a way that's less about experiencing the text, right? You're just trying to draw out to dos and, what you should not be doing. But I think what's really important to note is that, and this is something I'm trying to get through in the class, is kind of speaking about why this is in poetry. For example, I mean, thousands of years ago, there was a very famous Sanskrit. He was a linguist, he was a grammarian, he was a political theorist. His name was Partha Hari, and he writes this couplet, and it says, Sahit Sangeet Kala Vihina Sakshat Pashu Pushvashan Hina. That without the understanding of sahit, meaning literature, sangeet, music, like rag, etc., poetry, without understanding any of that, sakshat pashu, that person in reality is a pasu. He's an animal. He's a beast of burden, like a donkey or an ox, right? Puchvashanhina, without horns, without a tail. Now you could be like, oh, this guy is being a jerk. It's typical of kind of Indian judgmental sayings, and he's just being really mean, etc. And this is actually, what are we going to learn from this? Maybe he's only saying it because he's partisan to poets. He himself was a poet, etc. He wrote these shatakas. He wrote these, compositions of 100 verses, etc. in poetry. But this is an idea, the importance of poetry, that has held currency for, as I was saying, like thousands of years in the Indian subcontinent, right? In that, what he's trying to say there is that poetry is what separates kind of the beast from the man, right? Being a person, being a human being, and having the ability to learn about poetry, music, all of these arts, they're not just there to represent one's status in like the upper class, like bourgeoisie, etc., like this, or trying to be elites and stuff like this. What poetry and the music and these arts are trying to do, if done with the correct intention, is to open one's heart, right? Is to kind of transform one's experience, to feel these feelings of, they could be of any of the rasas, from they could be about beauty, humility, wonder, awe, affection, uh, compassion, etc. Right? And somebody who swims in those, in all of these different rasas, swims in on the ocean, that person's going to be quite different than, just the normal person stuck in the rat race trying to accumulate wealth, right? And in that sense, that's what Father Hadi's talking about. Like, those people are just beasts of burden, right? They're just going through the motion, right? They're not actually transforming their experience. They're not feeling all of these different experiences, which then transform one's action too. It's not just about, having these different delights that you're eating. They actually change one's action, and that's what I mean to say that devotional poetry, when you say that Guru Granth Sahib or Japji Sahib's devotional poetry, which is true in the sense that it's devotional, it's oriented in a fashion, bhakti oriented to service, to love, to the divine. But what gets missed out there in a connotation, not technically, but in this kind of sense that it's not actually a call to action. But Gurbani has these calls to action where, if you are transformed in a certain experience, right, then you are going to act in a certain way as well. And then Gurbani does promote that, right? Does promote, okay, forget If you think dharam or religious action, righteous action is the highest, well, what about a compassion? Compassion should, and this is going to come out in Jap Ji Sahib, orient all of your religious practice, right? And this is, most people know this line in Jap Ji Sahib, right? That, righteousness, dharam, is the son of compassion, right? So, another thing I wanted to mention in regard to divine poetry or devotional poetry is that the gurus themselves, if you look in Guru Granth Sahib, Guru Nanak is not calling himself a guru, right? Guru Nanak is calling himself a poet, right? There's a line in Gurbani, Nanak Sire Eve Kehte Sache Parvadgara. That Nanak, the poet, Sire means poet, it's like saying Kavi. Nanak the Kavi is saying Eve Kehte Sache Parvadgara, that Paramatma, you are the true Rab, or the divine, you are the true cherisher, etc. That's what he is identifying himself with, right? And Guru Gobind Singh as well, if you look in the writings of Guru Gobind Singh, some of the most famous compositions like the Banti Chopai composition, it starts with the heading, the Sarlek Kavi Uvach, right? Kavi Uvach or Ubach, meaning the speech of the poet, right? He identifies himself as a poet. Even actually, when you go to his composition where he's talking about himself, that autobiographical composition of the Chitra Natak, it says Kavi Janam Kathanam. The Kathanam, the description of the Janam, the birth of the Kavi, right? He's not talking about, oh, now is the birth of the Guru, and this is how he's identifying himself as a poet, right? And this is really important to kind of really stress, and this is what's going to be brought up in the course, is that to understand Gurbani, you have to understand how they were writing poetically, right? The Gurus themselves are poets. Guru Granth Sahib, there's not one composition in Guru Granth Sahib that's not in poetry, right? It's not, the Gurus didn't write in prose. They didn't write in the way that we are presenting our translations, right? They're writing them poetically. Throughout all of Guru Granth Sahib, it's not even organized by author to say that, okay, we're going to put all of Guru Nanak's first, and then we're going to put Guru Angad Dev Ji, Guru Amar Das Ji, etc. It's organized by musical mode, rag, right? You have, of course, you have the first Nithanim, 3 composition, Jap Ji Sahib, Sodar, which is the Reras, and then Sohila, and then you have Siddhi Rag, and then Siddhi Rag, etc. You have this list of the different ragas, right? And then at the end of Guru Granth Sahib, how amazing is this? You don't even, so you have a list of the different rags, the rag mala that comes at the very end. And even the list of the different rags is in poetic meter. It's in the Chopai meter. It's like, it starts off rag ek sang panch barangan, sang alape artho nandan, prasma rag pe arove karhi, pancharagani sang ucharhi. Like, it's in a Chopai meter. How sick is that? That even the list, they're going to compose that in poetry. So this is something that I think we need to talk about more. And I think it's really important because in the past, I would say 2 to 3 generations, this has really kind of faded away from our community. Whereas if you read the writings of Bhai Veer Singh, when he's talking about him growing up, Bhai Veer Singh is kind of maybe the most famous Sikh author of the 20th century. He's talked about as being like kind of the 6th river of Punjab. He really promotes Punjabi literature. He himself is this wonderful poet who not only wrote in Punjabi, but Braj Bhasha as well. When he grew up, he was talking about living in Amritsar. Along the Parikrama of Darbar Sahib in Amritsar, they would have these Kavi Darbars, these kind of poetry recitals. And you'd have these like the greats of the time there. Gani Gyan Singh was there. He's the author of Naveen Pant Prakash, extraordinary poet. You had people like Baba Sameer Singh from the lineage of Guru Amar Das Ji, who's an extraordinary poet as well. He wrote many works. And you have all of these, and of course, Veer Singh's dad was a great poet as well in Braj Bhasha. Also, he knew Sanskrit, and he wrote in Punjabi as well, etc. So you had all of these greats kind of getting together and having these poetry recitals. My family, which lived in Africa for some time, it was like that generation, my Dadaji's generation, my grandfather's generation, where you would still have these poetry recitals, and everybody in the community would go and kind of recite their poetry, even if they were not a great poet. Everybody would kind of go up and kind of present their own poetry. It just created this baseline of understanding of poetry, which we just don't have today. And that is something the course is trying to give back, is trying to think through how poetry is kind of setting the frame of Gurbani, and without understanding that how much you do lose, right? And I think that's something that has really changed in the past 100 years when we look at Gurbani, and that's something that is really apparent when you look at translation. So, for this reason, during the course, we're going to talk a lot about poetry, the poetry of Guru Nanak, how in Jap Ji Sahib, different poetic devices are being used in a certain way to evoke certain feelings and also to present different meanings. This is an aspect of the course that I want to go into as well with you, to talk about how in Gurbani, you have multiple meanings depending on, and these are purposeful, right? The author includes words that have known multiple meanings, right? I mean, you have these loaded terms in Gurbani, like Gurmukh. Like, what does Gurmukh mean? You can have 3 to 4 easily meanings of what Gurmukh means, right? And the Guru in the poetry is writing it in such a way that he's playing with these multiple meanings, right? And depending on where you are situated, what perspective you have as well, you're going to interpret the Bani in a different way as well. And this is something that, this is not just hairy fairy type of, I think Gurbani says this, so I'm going to take it this way. I think that it's going to promote my kind of view of whatever lifestyle I want to have, so I'm going to interpret it in this way. No, 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 that's not what this is doing. You have commentators from the 18th century, from Mani Singh, probably Mani Singh Shahid, who has a commentary, all the way up until modern times, the 20th century, where they talk about, different perspectives that are embedded throughout Gurbani, right? So they have done the kind of the hermeneutical, this means kind of ways of interpreting Gurbani. They've kind of developed these frameworks for hundreds of years, right? About 300 years, you have this work to kind of identify these different frameworks in Gurbani, and they kind of draw out and they explain how, okay, this line is speaking to, let's say, a devotional perspective. When they're talking about, what does it mean to be a Padshah, right? In Jap Ji Sahib says, "Just no bakshe sif salah, nanak padshah hi padshah ho." That person who is given bhakti, devotion, right? Who has that, because you have to be given this in kind of a Sikh mentality, right? Gurbani is requesting uh, from the divine this privilege, this gift, this great dawn, to have a kind of a devotional mindset, and that person is real Padshah. Now you're gonna say, okay, so how does that conflict with Sikh, let's say, thought on political strategy, right? Are we gonna make the most devotional person, the Padshah, the Pant? So you're gonna have to balance these different perspectives when looking at Gurbani, and you have commentaries from the 18th century that have been doing this, for a very long time. So um, one way to think about this is that, like a piece of artwork, depending on who's looking at it, they're going to interpret it in a different way. And poetry is artwork, right? So this is something I want to stress, is that without understanding the medium, right, the way in which this artwork is formed, like poetry, with certain verses, with certain terms that are being used across communities, like the term Satanam is being used by Kabir Panthis, the terms Ik Onkar, which I'm going to go into as well. You might have heard from modern, let's say, prachariks or preachers, that this is a very novel term, right? That Ik Onkar is Guru Nanak creating something that has never been used before. But actually, Gurbani is using many terms that people are using at the time, and I'm going to show you how the Gorakhpanthis have used this. In Gorakhbani, Ik Onkar comes up. In Sufi literature, Ik Onkar comes up. And then we're going to look at, okay, how have Sikhs like Bhai Gurdas, Mani Singh Shahid, etc., how have they explained what that term means, right? And contrasting that with other people as well. So there's a lot to get into when talking about the course, and kind of we can slowly, as you ask questions, go into it a little bit more. But those are some elements that will come up in the course.
There were two things that I wanted to pick your brain on as you were discussing, which was, so first of all, obviously compassion. I think that is obviously key, and it comes up again and again in Sikhi. But in relation to Jap Ji Sahib, I guess the paradox of compassion, in the sense that ultimately if you were to take compassion to kind of its extreme, there is like, where do you call a boundary, I guess, is actually the way of rephrasing that question. So that's one question in terms of how does Jap Ji Sahib or how does Sikhi deal with that. But then secondly, I think one thing that you mentioned almost in passing that I think is quite key is that Gurbani is written in poetry, but our translations aren't. So not only is there a loss of in translating something from one language to the other, but also in the format that it's gone to, it's now completely a different experience or teaching or whatever.
Well, I need to ask you, like, are you talking about the paradox of compassion related to Sikh notions of martiality, like the martial community, and how does that pair with compassion, or what exactly
Well,
are
I
you?
guess I guess a bit of both. Yeah, it could be that, but also it could just be as simple as like, well, I don't know, I'm driving down the road and someone cuts me up or some shit, and I just I blow my top. Like, there's no compassion in that, right? But most people listening to this have definitely done that or experienced that, and then afterwards they're kind of sat there going, "Meh, probably shouldn't have blown up like that." My kind of question is more so like, how does I think a lot of the time, and this is probably more so from a personal perspective, on social media, every other thing you see is someone trying to teach you something called tell you something called sell you something, and it's kind of like, oh, if you do this, this will happen. If you're compassionate or if you're whatever, you'll unlock this new kind of way of life. I guess I'm actually trying to stick a spanner in the works and say, okay, that's fine, but in a practical manner, how does that like actually pan out, and how do we deal with the problem of, well, actually, if it's just compassion, what is like the measuring stick? Because, like, again, going back to that really trivial example of the car, okay, I may have blown my top one time, but the other time, actually, I get so angry, I get out of the car and I want to start a fight with the person. Like, is there compassion in that? I don't think so. But like, how do we internalize that rather than just think it? How do we actually deal with that on a practical basis or on a daily problem?
Well, something I'm going to be talking about in the course. Actually, that's a really great question, and we had not talked about that beforehand. And it's brilliant because actually it just reminds me an element of the course where what we are going to be looking at is how the structure of the community itself, the Sikh community, has created these practices that you can actually embody these elements. And what I mean by that is it allows for the cultivation of these gun, these qualities, right? And you can think about it in three different perspectives. And these three different perspectives are things that is a framework that will be used to explain different ways of practicing and thinking about Gurbani. So you're asking about compassion. From a karma perspective, from an action perspective, we cultivate this quality, this guna, through, let's say, langar, through Sikhs going out and establishing free kitchens, from Sikhs going out and serving those people in need, helping those people in need. This can be, politically helping them, let's say militarily helping them, financially, food, all of these elements, right? And you get to cultivate this in a gurdwara, right? You're cultivating this through the practice of seva, right? And that's kind of looking at it from a Karam perspective. These qualities, I would have to say again as well, need to be cultivated, need to be embodied, need to be practiced, right? Before you kind of really see them in their full form. And what I mean to say is that, okay, intellectually, like you're saying, oh, I read Jap Ji Sahib, I should be compassionate, but somebody cuts me off in traffic, and immediately I want to just bust their head in, right? Intellectually, you know what you should do, but you are being overcome by two things, anger, primarily, right? So how do you kind of put up a guard? How do you combat that? Is by cultivating those qualities which are in direct opposition to that. For one, forgiveness, and another one, compassion, right? Daya and Kema. So these two, while you're practicing, seva, and while you're at the Gurdwara, or seeing the whole world as a Gurdwara as well, right? Kind of having that expansionist view. It starts initially at the Gurdwara, right? But then the ideal perspective is kind of expanding it. And then from a devotional perspective, you are so from Gautam perspective is you're helping people. From a devotional perspective, you are then seeing Paramatma in that person that cut you off, and you are saying, "Oh Paramatma, you've cut me off." Dasme Pasha, Guru Nanak, Guru Gobind Singh. All right, yeah, I'm gonna let you have that one. It's all right. I must have deserved it, right? You have to understand Gautam philosophy then as well, which is something that we're going to talk about, and which was a question that came up in the comments on Instagram as well. Like, are we going to be looking at karma or Gautam philosophy? And that is something that comes up in Guru Nanak's Bani, Jap Ji Sahib, and Guru Granth Sahib as well, right? How do you balance uh, these different thoughts of Gautam philosophy, which is, action, reaction, cause and effect, and other parts of Gurbani which talk about, there is no coming and there is no going, right? So if there's no coming and going, then how can there be any account, right? If we are not going to Dharmaraja's court, the judge of the divine, if we're not going to his court after we die, then, does karma even exist? Does karma even exist? So we're trying to draw a through line. We're trying to connect how these different streams of thought are then kind of merging into one. And then from a Gyan perspective, you're thinking that, well, that person is me, right? How can I be angry at such a person? And this actually is interesting because this comes up in Mani Singh Shahid's commentary from the 18th century when explaining Nirvair, the divine is without hatred, anger, all of that. How is that possible? Because there's no other but the divine, right? You wouldn't get angry at yourself. You'd be like, you'd see yourself in that person that cut you off, right? And again, those qualities have to be cultivated. There's a practice associated with that, a communal practice and a personal practice, right? And those two things we're going to be talking about throughout the course, right? So not only, okay, is Guru Nanak talking about these things theoretically, intellectually, but you have whole systems that have been developed in the congregation that allow for the cultivation of these qualities, right? And Jap Ji Sahib also says, "Vin gun kite bhagat na hoy," right? Without cultivating gun kite, without cultivating these qualities of compassion, daya, dharam, sandok, all of these, like forgiveness, empathy, all of these qualities, without cultivating that, how are you going to be a devotee? How are you going to cultivate devotion, right? So it's a really important aspect that we will be talking about. It was the second part to that question as well.
Yeah, not only do we lose meaning in translating from language to the other, but I think the subtle change which you highlighted is that you go from poetry to prose. So you've actually gone from something that's a piece of art to something that's far more instructional. And yeah, there wasn't necessarily a question on my part. It was more just kind of like, when someone says something and something just goes boop. And I was like, oh, that actually changes everything because I haven't read a translation ever that is written in the same kind of poetic format, which like is just a point in itself.
And just on that point, this is something that I'm going to be talking about at the beginning of module 1, actually, is that there was this very famous Chinese translator of Sanskrit literature, Buddhist literature. He was an extraordinary translator. He translated, some of the earlier Buddhist texts into Chinese. And even he was talking about kind of the problem with his endeavor. He was saying that, translating Sanskritic literature is like eating rice, chewing it, and then trying to give that chewed rice to somebody else. Not only have you extracted the flavor, which is what I was talking about, rasa, right? That flavor, the experience, but also you've made that person sick by doing that. Like that guy's like, oh, this is disgusting. I'm not eating your juta. Like I'm not eating your chewed rice. And he says that while being such an extraordinary translator. And even to this day, some of those works that he translated in the 5th century are used in Buddhist, schools. So there is kind of we do have to basically think about the limitations to our project of, largely the class is made up of students who English is their first language or their Punjabi is not, let's say Punjabi is their first language, but they don't have the skills to understand the technical language in these commentaries, and they don't have the historical understanding of the context of the conversations happening at that time. And that's really important, and I can't stress that enough. And that's something that academia actually wonderfully stresses. Not that sampradaya knowledge or, let's say, traditional learning institutions don't do, they do this as well. But I think academia really stresses this, is that they really think through the conversations that are happening broadly. So, for example, in Bhai Mani Singh Shahid, in his commentary related to the Mool Mantar, which I'll be posting online, I've translated that. There's a discussion about Satanam and what does Satanam mean. And in that discussion, it's basically a response to the Vedantic community at that time. So in Advaita and non-dualistic Vedanta, you have this idea that Nam and Roop, name and form, are mithya, are illusionary. And then the question gets posed, right, to Guru Nanak and say, okay, you're saying that divine, his name is true, or whose name is true, but name is all illusionary, right? You can only have name because it comes out of Maya. If you have a name, it is defining something which requires a delineation, all right? It requires a kind of a setting in boundary, right? So if you have this, you have duality, right? Name is a product of duality. This is the argument from, Advaita, a non-dualistic perspective. And Guru Nanak Dev Ji, actually in Mani Singh's commentary, is a very fascinating answer to that, very technical in kind of attacking the foundation of that Nam Roop Mithya understanding. And that's something that's maybe too technical. We'll talk about that in the course. But the point is that these conversations are happening. And something I also
So
will
just
talk
quickly
about in
on
the
that,
course. Sorry?
sorry, just quickly on that. So the argument is from their perspective that if you can name something, it is by default an illusion because you can name it, and by naming it, there's a separation, which I kind of get. It's also kind of like that. Is it the gold slit experiment where when they're not looking at it, the particles act in a different way, and when they are looking at it, it behaves in a completely different manner?
Let's talk about that, because
Okay,
that's
go for
really
it.
relevant to this.
Yeah, yeah.
Both aspects of it, because it's not like what those siddhs, what those yogis are saying, and also what from the Advaita perspective, it's not that they're saying what they're saying is untrue. It is true, right?
But it's a different perspective, though.
Exactly.
Like, yeah, yeah, yeah.
So in Gurbani, all the time you'll have Guru Nanak, Guru Gobind Singh writes this Anam right? Paramatma is that without name, right? Because name is a kind of a, you can't define Paramatma. By defining Paramatma, you are then kind of putting it in a box, right? You're putting Paramatma in a box. There has to be an other. A box has an inside, has an outside, right? Paramatma is beyond that, right? But what are they talking about when they say that? They're talking about Paramatma in the Nirguna, in the formless kind of perspective, right? These are perspectives. These are theories. These are frameworks. A theory meaning in the sense of thera coming from perspective to see. Thera means sight. It comes from the goddess of sight, Thera. Like darshan, we say darshan. We have chhe darshan. We have six classical Indian philosophies, perspectives. Darshan also means to sight, to see. The nirguna perspective and the sarguna perspective, right? Sikhi, as these commentators write about, actually in Guru Nanak Dev Ji's Bani, Guru Arjan Dev Ji's Bani, they make explicitly clear that Paramatma is both nirguna and sarguna, with form and without form. And these conversations are spoken at in length, at some great depth in these commentaries as well, even in Bhai Mani Singh Shahid's commentary, right? Responding back to them to say that no, Paramatma is not only nirguna, right? That Paramatma is also the Sarguna. And by forgetting that, you are kind of missing, you are actually, in a sense, ignoring or limiting the divine by saying that as well, right? That you're saying this is just mithya, the whole thing is mithya. There has to be a foundation, a foundation to this, an asara. And that asara is Paramatma. And what comes out of that asara as well, what comes out of that foundation, that is Paramatma as well, right? And that's why Nam is so important, because it is a identifier, it is a bodhak, it is a signifier for that nirguna, right? or the Sarguna, right? It identifies that. You begin to identify Paramatma with everything, right? You see Paramatma in everything, like Guru Gobind Singh saying, Jale Hari, Tale Hari, Ore Hari, Nabe Hari, like Paramatma is in the water, he's in the air, he's in the sky, he's in the ground, he's everywhere, right? He's like, Tu Hi, it's just Paramatma is everything.
But
So
isn't
Nam becomes
that,
really important in that sense.
but isn't that, mm, so hold on, I just need to phrase this properly, otherwise the subtlety is going to get lost. So, for me, the subtlety is that, so Guru Gobind Singh Ji is obviously writing that. That's coming from a perspective of actually, it's been internalized. It's not being intellectualized, because fundamentally the problem we're always going to have in trying to intellectualize it is that we are by default in a dualistic, like we live in a duality, and we're trying to comprehend something that's non-dual. So, for argument's sake, when you were saying the divine can be sargun or nirgun, in my head I was like, well, then what actually stops it being a bit of both at the same time? And that's actually like a third form. And I'm not like trying to be like difficult, but as in I'm just arguing, because actually if the divine is undefinable by default, even the definitions we have, just like you're saying, the theories all are a theory to a point, because they're all a different perspective, and all those perspectives will have pros or cons. It's like, I'm sure it was you who brought this up in the last podcast we did, but it's like that story of someone holding, like the blind guy holding the trunk, and the other guy holding the leg, and the other guy holding the tail, and it's all still the elephant, but they're all talking about different parts. Like, we can deliberate and we can intellectualize, but actually I guess that's why Nam is so important, because you're internalizing it. You're actually it's difficult to actually say it, because we're not trying to understand it, we're trying to embody it. I don't know quite what the word is.
So you're 100% right. I mean, that's a brilliant way to talk about it. The third, right, is
Mm.
because it's beyond. This is how Gurbani talks about it. It's beyond duality, and this is an aspect that we'll talk about throughout the course. Is that once you begin to see this emphasis on ik in Guru Granth Sahib, like Ik Onkar, is this idea that's beyond the duality, right? Of duatiya, of twos and threes, right? And twos in the sense of nirgun sargun, of me and other, of paramatma and not paramatma, jada chetan, all of these different dualities that we can have in our mind. Paramatma is beyond that, right? You can think of that as the third, or you can think about that as like as one, right? As a kind of a united. And the three meaning like three different gunas, qualities, rajotamo, sato, etc. These comes from Sankhya philosophy in India, which is largely kind of accepted throughout other philosophical systems. But my point being that it's very much like when we talk about Khalsa being the Tija Panth, right? A Tisra Panth, right? When we talk about that, that's almost like this kind of Zen koan, like it's the third beyond dualities, right? It's not just a third to say that, okay, you have two punts and now we're drawing another punt. So no, like the third is something that which is beyond duality, right? It is something that it's actually holistic, that's encompassing everything, that this is kind of beyond this kind of narrow perspective that, okay, we're going to be like this and everybody else sucks, and we're going to be like because that's everybody's perspective, right? That's just a natural manamata perspective of like, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm the best. And when we look at Gurbani, we see that a different perspective emerges, right? And I love that way that you mentioned it. Yeah, it's kind of this third way of looking at it. And that's exactly what I think Tisur Pant is.
You've kind of discussed it slightly in passing, but I just want to go back slightly. I think, I can't remember who I was talking to about this the other day, but again, a similar thing came up, which was essentially like, how do Sikhs view God, or does Ik Onkar mean more God? And I think for me, it's really interesting, because in the last decade or so, there's been a massive shift from Ik Onkar meaning one God to people actually now saying, no, that's not what that means. Whereas if you went back 15, 20 years ago, people in the Gurdwara would kick off with you if you mentioned that Ik Onkar didn't mean one God, because they thought we're arguing some type of atheistic argument. But actually, we're just completely abandoning the Judeo-Christian framework and saying, hold on, this isn't even anything to do with that. Now, coming to the question, I am actually asking you, from your perspective and from the course's teachings, what does Ik Onkar mean from what you've read? Is it a rejection, which some people would argue, of Om? is it a conversation with Islam? Again, when you mentioned Tisra Panth, a lot of people would argue that that's saying there's Hinduism, there's Islam, and then there's Sikhi as the third path, right? So how does that all come together? Is there a deeper kind of philosophical shift in what Guru Nanak Dev Ji is saying? Because you've also mentioned that Ik Onkar comes up prior to Guru Nanak Dev Ji. So what is going on there? What does it mean? I know that's a really deep question. Like that's a whole hour on its own. But yeah.
So in the course, we're going to be talking about how Ik Onkar has been defined, how people have interpreted it. One thing I wanted to really get across as well, and which makes this type of study problematic when studying alone, is that, especially if you don't have access to the older text, the pre-colonial text, is that there's a shift that happens in the colonial period, right? Where, like you mentioned, Ik Onkar has just been associated, has been defined as just having like one God, right? Sikhs believe in one God. Ik meaning one, Oañkār is God. There is one God, and that's the declaration, which was so, kind of revolutionary, right? Whereas, this idea about oneness is thousands of years old, across the world, right? This is not. You look at the Upanishads, obviously the Quran. This is not obviously. Let's say, I think what we can say about it is that that type of definition has been really informed during the colonial period. And this is something I'm going to talk about, starting with the problem is Trump, right? Donald Trump's a separate problem, but Ernest Trump is somebody who wrote a commentary on the writings
Yes.
of Guru Nanak, and some of Janam Sakhis. And people in the academic community, like Arvind Paul Mandare, etc., talk about how much of the material that arrives after Trump, which is like 1860s, 1880s, a lot of that material is really informed by Trump and actually is a response to Trump. Because when Trump was translating Guru Granth Sahib or those selections, he does most of City Dog, he does like Jap Ji Sahib, etc. He defines that as just the Ik Onkar is just Om to him. He's just saying, okay, they believe in Om. It must be some type of pantheistic type of revelation that Guru Nanak is speaking about. There doesn't seem to be any type of actual one philosophy in Guru Granth Sahib. It's kind of a mishmash. And this is Trump's idea, is that there's no actual kind of congruent or non-contradictory philosophy in Guru Granth Sahib. It's all just random thoughts, right? This is according to Trump, right? So much of the response to that has been informed by, number one, responding to that to kind of show, okay, like this is exactly what Guru Granth Sahib means. At no point is ambiguous or contradictory, which is actually doing it a disservice, right? Because poetry, if you read any poetry that we read today, English poetry, whatever, Punjabi poetry, you'll see that the poet, if he's really clever, is designing it so that there is this ambiguity within the text, right? So you can read it in multiple ways. When you listen to a good song, like a rap song or whatever, right, that's lyrically, sophisticated, you can listen to that over and over again, right? The more you listen to it, you're like, oh man, now I get this line, or from this perspective, I can see it that way, right? And that's what Gurbani is as well. I should say that's what poetry does, right? And I think that gets missed out. People have been translating since that time in a way that kind of flattens the text, right? Or kind of extracts all of those elements because they want to respond to Trump, to say that, no, Guru Granth Sahib is very congruent. It has a standard philosophy in it. And this is the philosophy. We believe in one God. We don't believe in pantheism. We are separate from Hindus as well. They're trying to make this claim that within Guru Granth Sahib, there is absolutely no similarity to Indic thought. At that point, they're very, even now, like some of these research institutes and what have you, it's very fashionable to say, oh, look at Guru Nanak Dev Ji writes in Persian, and they can draw all these similarities to Islamic culture and Persian culture, which is great. That's true, and that's absolutely right. And it's not that it doesn't exist. It's like they're very comfortable with those connections and those similarities, sharing in that commonality, which is really important. Gurbani and this type of poetry is written to Number one, share in commonality, to kind of take part in a broader discussion. And that's not to say that there's differences, right? There are differences, right? And there are responses given by the gurus to different ways of thought. Like I was just mentioning about the response to Advaita, a response to the yogis, a response to Vaishnava communities who are very much uh, solely focused on Sarguna worship, or worship with the divine with form. There are these conversations, but at the same time, there are all these similarities, right, and commonalities. But in more modern times, we're very comfortable in drawing commonalities with Islamic traditions because of the political situation today, where many Sikhs see themselves in direct political opposition with, let's say, the broader Indic community, right? And that hurts our and that hurts our interpretations of Gurbani, right? Because what you end up doing then is you end up ignoring all of those Indic elements. And that's a problem since Trump, that people like Veer Singh and etc. They're great, you know, writers and interpreters, and they have so much more knowledge than any of us in this generation can aspire to, just because of their situation. But at the same time, they're very handicapped. And I will say that with humility, that these people were in a political situation at the time where there was a need to really kind of push against other communities for, you could say it was out of survival or political benefit of certain communities to kind of just begin attacking each other. But what I'm trying to say here is that the interpretations that have come out from the 1880s onward are inflected with this communal kind of conflict, and in that way they are doing a disservice to terms like Ik Onkar. So for example, if we're going to talk about interpreting Ik Onkar, I will start off again kind of returning to that point that you mentioned about defining. Okay, how do we define God? They're going to say, okay, Ik Onkar is the definition of God. And then we can go back to that idea that, okay, you can't define. How are you going to delineate? How are you going to kind of put Paramatma, Rab into a box, right? Number one, what the commentators do when they are kind of looking at Mool Mantar, which is considered this kind of, you could say, description, you could say kind of thinking about the qualities of the divine, right? They look at two qualities: Srup Lakshan and Tatash Lakshan. Means basically one is the quality Lakshan of the form of the divine, and one is ancillary or kind of incidental qualities of the divine. And I'll kind of break that down. So when you talk about Sat in the after Ik Onkar, it goes Sat and then separate Nam. Some commentators have put those together, Sat and Nam together, and that is one definition. But primarily the definitions for that term are separate. Sat is separate and Nam is separate, right? And Sat is a Srup Lakshan, is a quality which defines or which speaks to the form of the divine. The divine is true, right? And Ik Onkar is going to be doing essentially the same thing, is that the Ik there is to speak to the non-duality of Paramatma, and the Oañkār is going to speak to the multiplicity of Paramatma, right? And that is separate. You can separate that Oañkār. One of the commentaries, by Mani Singh Shahid's commentary, talks about Oañkār comes from three sounds, basically, right? Om, A-U-M, right? And each of these represents a different quality. And these qualities are then personified in Indic cosmology and Indic mythology, right? You have Brahma being the creator is one element. You have Vishnu being the sustainer is another element, and Shiva being the destroyer, another element, right? And these represent the whole multiplicity of the whole creation, right? And that these two elements about non-duality and multiplicity are actually, this represents, like you were talking about that experiment, talking about the paradox, right? It represents this Nirgun Sadgun paradox, right? Like, is the divine actually just one, or can we think about the divine in multiplicity? Well, it depends how you are viewing that, right? How you're thinking through the kind of what perspective you are taking. So, Ik Onkar has been defined in many different ways. If you look at Farid Kortika, you will this Faridkot Tika is a commentary Tika produced by the Faridkot court, essentially, kind of the royals, patroned a number of scholars. Badan Singh was the main scholar, I believe, Gyani Badan Singh. And he was kind of working amongst many other people. That whole definition of Ik Onkar is like, I forget how long, 10 pages, maybe 15 pages. It's quite a long explanation of Ik Onkar. If you look at Sant Gurbani Singh from the Damdam Itiksal Jathapinra, his commentary itself on Mool Mantar is something like 50 to 100 pages, like massive, right? So you can go into insane amount of depth when thinking about Ik Onkar and kind of explaining how that relates to the divine, the world, and kind of this paradox between Nirgun and Sargun. Or you could just look at it in a very concise way, as Sant Guru Bachchan Singh says, it's just one adutti, like without a dual Paramatma. Then Oañkār is basically, the Paramatma is the Prakashik, is kind of the creator, illuminator, one that puts divine consciousness in all of creation, right? The Om, which is those three qualities. So there's varied ways of interpreting Ik Onkar, and that is something that we're going to go into a considerable amount of depth in the first module. For example, you have these definitions like this, you have these explanations, and at the same time, what I find so interesting is that these commentators in these texts, they don't only just intellectualize these. And what I want to say is this, is that when talking about Ik Onkar, for example, they say, okay, that's one definition. Faridkot does this, for example. So what's the Ik there for? The Ik there is for that everybody has adhkar, has right to, number one, divine knowledge, bhakti, all of these things, right? Because Oañkār and some of the Sanskritic literature of old, according to some texts, right, and according to some traditions, they wouldn't allow people of lower caste to even hear certain Sanskritic literature being recited, right? If you were a Shudra, if you were somebody from low, and I say low in the sense of their schema, a marginalized caste person, you were denied the right to even listen to scripture, right? And the Ik there, for the commentators of the Faridkot Tika, represents that everybody has adhkar, everybody has right. Women, children, people of marginalized castes, everybody is considered to be a part of that whole, So they actually provide even like actionable interpretations of the scripture. For example, something I found really, really interesting from Swami Harnamdas Udasi's commentary of Mool Mantar. He says that the Sat there in Satanam relates to Sach Bolana, and that Guru Nanak there is putting there the the supreme practice right at the beginning of Mool Mantar. That truth, right? Sat is so important that Maharaj put it, Guru Nanak Dev Ji put it at the beginning of Mool Mantar, right? And that should be action. Like you should live your life. Every time when you recite Mool Mantar, you're thinking Sat, and you're thinking, okay, I should, be speaking the truth, right? So they don't only include these definitions that are going to provide these like, extraordinary intellectual, interpretations, and you'll be like, oh, that's such a brilliant interpretation. It's actually actionable. For example, in Mani Singh Shahid's definition of Sachkhand, which I've posted, you can read it on Instagram, the Study Sikhi Instagram. He talks about Sachkhand being Sad Sangat. When it says Sachkhand Vasya Nirankar, that Paramatma resides within the true congregation, right? And that's kind of encouraging us to go into Sangha, the congregation, with that kind of intention, with that love, right? And I find that those types of definitions so beautiful, because it's not just this kind of abstract idea, okay, I have to think about Paramatma like this. No, it's like guiding how you are living today, right? And I find that really beautiful. There's actually something really interesting that comes up in the Karam Khand, and when they're talking about this, we're going to go into this. I think this is the last module, number 6, where we go into the Khands, these different realms at the end of Jap Ji Sahib. And this is cool because a lot of people, and sure, you can interpret this way, people interpret these realms, Sachkhand, Garam Khand, Saram Khand, etc., as places, like desh, like residence, like countries. Like, I'm gonna go to UK, that's Saramkand, or Japan is gotta be like Aramkand or whatever, right? And I think that's what's really interesting about these definitions is like when he's talking about Karamkand, he's talking about those people who are doing Karam, meaning good action. And then Mani Singh glosses what's good action is Bhakti. And he's saying those people who are performing this great devotion to the Guru, to Paramatma, etc., those people are residing in this liberative state, in this mukti, right? And then he talks about, okay, this mainly, in Vaishnava communities, they talk about char mukti, on like 4 types of mukti, salok, surup, samip, samuj, or sajuj, sorry, right? And I'll define what these mean, but he says, okay, like these all are available to Sikhs, right, who are performing devotion, who are in this Karam Khand, right? And then the Sikhs ask Mani Singh, it says this in the text. They say, okay, you've talked about these 4 types of muktis, salok meaning you are liberated, you're liberated, you are living in the salok, the actual realm of your isht, of your divine, right? Sarup meaning you take the actual form, sarup, of the divine in that realm. Samip meaning, this is the 3rd type of mukti, you are right, close to the divine, like angsang, you are right beside the divine, right? Samip meaning nere, you're close to. Shajuj meaning you have merged now with the divine, right? And the Sikhs ask, Mani Singh, they say, okay, like, sure, these are technical definitions, right? Can you actually show us what this looks like in real life, right? And Mani Singh says, understand where Mani Singh is at this point, right? Mani Singh is in the Darbar Sahib complex. He's doing katha to the Singhs there, Surat Singh, Gurbak Singh, all these types of Singhs who are writing these texts down, right? Gaur Singh, etc. And he's saying, listen, Slok Mukti is living in heaven, right? That's Mukti is living in heaven. It's akin to living in Amritsar, right? Look, Amritsar is heaven. He says this, where rich and poor can live in peace. There's no fear when you're living in Amritsar from anybody else, right? This is heaven if you're living in Amritsar. Like, you gotta have all these things around here protecting you. There's free food here. This is heaven, right? And then he says, okay, what about Srup Mukti, right? Where you become the form of the divine, right? And the divine being, Chaturpuj, Vishnu, whatever. It could be Guru Gobind Singh. He says that's in the kind of Vaishnava thought, Chaturmukh being the divine, having 4 arms, Vishnu, this type of form. He says for us, what this is living in Amritsar, taking the Swarup of Guru Gobind Singh, adopting Kesh, Kirpan, and Kach, right? These symbols. And having that form, you are now the Swarup of Guru Gobind Singh. You are living in peace. You are at that Swarup Mukti here, living in Amritsar. And then they say, okay, what about Samip Mukti? It says, look, we're in Amritsar. There's all these bungas all around the Parkarama. If you're living in them, right, you're living right beside the Darbar Sahib, you're listening to Shabads. He's like, that is heaven. That is, Savarg. And that is Samip Mukti, because you're right beside Haramandir Sahib, you're right beside Paramatma Rab. And they say, okay, what about Sajuj, the highest, right, where you're merged into the divine? And he says, those people that sit in the Darbar Sahib, they keep the Srup or the Khalsa, they have erased, they have kind of dissipated, they kind of expelled this abhiman, this kind of association to one's body. Such a person has obtained Paramatma, and that's such a person, they have merged with the form of Maharaj. They are Sajuj Mukt, right? And so he's giving like these actionable, like, definitions, interpretations of these different types of muktis. And he talks about Vidya Mukta as well, etc. Like, there's other types of muktis as well. It's not just buying into the frame of Vaishnava thought of these 4 types of muktis. But you can see how they kind of reinterpret them for Sikh context with Sikh practice, right? And you're taking the form Sarup Mukti means to have Kachkesh, Kirpan, etc., right? These symbols of Guru Gobind Singh. The form that we take is, Guru Gobind Singh's form, right? So, I mean, this is just what I love about, these old commentaries. This is so deep. They're so actionable. They represent a different way of looking at Gurbani than we have seen in the 20th century, in the late 19th century. And unfortunately, they've not been kind of promoted. They've not been translated, right? So they're not accessible to people. And even if you take courses in universities, I'll be frank, wherever across the world, right? they rarely engage with a lot of the pre-colonial material. And there's reasons to that. They're difficult to interpret. The language and the context requires a lot of education to go through. And since I'm going through it, I'll be translating this. I thought it would be amazing to share this type of material with people, and I hope they will enjoy it. And I think they will enjoy it because these texts are just brilliant.
So you mentioned in passing a couple of times as we've been talking that there's a massive shift that happens during the colonial period, and you've kind of briefly touched upon Trump. Obviously not Donald Trump, but I would argue perhaps a predecessor who writes one of the earliest,
Especially John,
or
yeah.
yeah, or at least the first English encounter with um the Gurgan Sahib Ji. I think what was interesting is earlier today I was doing some research. So I can't remember what book I had gotten hold of, but there was a chapter in it. That's right. There was a journal online that I'd found because I was researching something to do with like the Middle East, and there was a podcast I was going to do with or have done with a historian who talks about that. And basically, the Dutch are very instrumental in kind of the early history of that area of the world. And I then just happened to realize that the Dutch East India Company essentially exists from about the point of Gurjin Dev Ji to literally one of the last letters they write from Jakarta back to the Dutch offices in the Netherlands is saying the Sikh Ranjit Singh has taken the throne of Lahore, and that's in obviously 1799. Now, the reason why I mentioned that I'm gone off on a segue is because you are obviously 1,000% right that Trump solidifies kind of the beginning of the whole conversation from that point on, because it's a conversation with the British. The whole Singh Sabha thing, no matter where they go on, whether they're Sanatan or traditional or whatever you want to label them, whatever part of the spectrum, they're all engaging with the British. And the reason I say that is because the Dutch, as early as 1675, this is almost 100 years before any of the British are really engaging with the Sikhs, are already calling us Sikhs. There's a diary of a Dutch guy who in 1712 or something writes back to his officers, and he's like, yeah, these Sikhs keep their hair and they carry swords. So again, one of the earliest records of Khalsa identity from a European, and it's not a Brit, and it's very clear in the language. So that's more just kind of a case in point. What I want to actually kind of ask you is then, obviously missionary logic comes in. Trump is the head of this. Could you elaborate slightly on what changes? Like, obviously we've touched upon how we go from a pre-colonial worldview to a religious paradigm, for want of better words. And is it simply driven by the idea of wanting to separate Sikhi into a distinct religious tradition? In other words, I guess I'm actually asking you, is Oberoi's book what is driving this? Because he's essentially arguing, well, one of the arguments he writes in Construction of Religious Boundaries is much of this period is driven by Sikhs wanting to create a distinct religion. So hence why we have a lot of these life cycle rituals being created. So the name birthing ceremony, the Antam Sanskar ceremony, and all of these other things. So I know, again, it's a massive question, but where would you go with that?
A couple of things there. Just touching on that last point about life cycles and Oberoi is very useful, Oberoi's book. But one thing related to life cycles is that it's not that Sikhs were now beginning to create their own religion in separation of Indic tradition, is that the idea of religion itself became quite different with the advent of the British, right? And what I mean by that is, to be a separate religion meant that one has these set of life cycles, right? The Sikh tradition needed then a marriage ceremony that was distinct. It needed then, a death ceremony that was distinct. And you see like the impulse beyond, like, in the writings during that colonial period, which Oberoi is absolutely right, right? But what causes that is the shift, and which is where I draw from Mandir, is very useful, is it says the idea of religion itself shifts during this period, right? And it shifts because the narrative is set by the missionaries, right? It's the missionaries that say, okay, you need an absolute, very differentiated life cycle, practice. You needed this. You need different ideas about divinity, etc. Right? So what happens with Trump is that, and this is again, I'm drawing from Mendere, is that he talks about how Trump sets the tone in relation to monotheism, right? That that there becomes this currency that if you are a tradition which is, and this is not just what happens to Sikhs, by the way. I mean, this is what happens to these other traditions, these other societies. Like you have Singh Sabha, and you have Arya Samaj, you have Brahmo Samaj, you have all these different Samajas as well, right? In the Indic tradition as well, Hinduism broadly, that are responding to this idea that, oh yeah, you know what? Actually, Hinduism is not pantheism. We also are monotheistic, right? They're responding to, they're playing into this game that if you are a tradition that's worth its weight, or if that's important, then you are to be monotheistic, right? And you have these really funny discussions back and forth to be like, you know, oh, actually, Christianity is not even monotheistic. Look, you got the Trinity, you have these three, you have, the Christ, the body, etc. And it is us Hindus who believe in non-duality. Thus, we are monotheistic, right? So you have these conversations happening, and Sikh commentators also had fallen into that to say that, um, Sikhism is an ism and is a tradition with a box, and we are clearly distinct, and we have one God, just like the Islamic and Christian faith, in the exact same way, right? So we're playing into those models, right? And that's what is different in these ideas about divinity. So if you're looking Gurbani, then, and this is where this becomes problematic, is that, well, how come in Gurbani you have at times where they say the Guru himself is Paramatma, or you say the Sikh himself is Paramatma as well. Guru Sikh, Sikh Guru hai. You have these lines as well, right? You have this expansion of, okay, what is divinity? And then you're seeing divinity in the world. You're seeing it in the Sangat, which Sangat har pravasya, like you have Paramatma residing in the Sangat as well, right? The Sangat is the Rupa Paramatma. The whole world is the Rupa Paramatma, right? And these types of ideas don't fit neatly into this box of like, okay, there's one God, and then the by doing that, in a sense, by fitting into that Christian framework, we are saying that, okay, God's over there, and then we're over here. This is a separation, right? So that's what really changes when we talk about the arrival of Trump. And one thing I wanted to know when you're talking about the Dutch and previous, let's say, writings related to the Sikhs, it's not that anybody's arguing that the Sikh community didn't exist as a kind of identifiable group, right? I mean, even in Persian writings, Hakikat is from the 18th century. I think it's like 1750. I mean, you can go on and kind of go through these texts. This is actually an aspect of my dissertation that I wrote about, this kind of tisrapant, right? That this idea of the community as its own separate community, and again, in this kind of double play of saying that we are beyond duality, that we are stressing for commonality and coming together, that that idea is not a new idea, this tisrapant, that you have the Khalsa, and that's like a Sikh identity. That idea is as old, and even Oberoi mentions this, that's as old as Guru Gobind Singh's command, right, in 1699, during that time period, right? It's just that what changes during the colonial period is that you even see it today, is today we've gone so far from this, is that to be a member of a certain community means the natural exclusion from other communities, right? What it means is they're totally separate. There's no commonality. Sikhi has no commonality with Hinduism or Islam, right? And to say there's a commonality is to reduce the
Used to be
prominence.
blasphemous.
Yeah. It's to say
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
oh, well, it's not important then if it's not unique, right?
Mm.
Uniqueness is considered during this period, right? An attribute of importance, right? That if you present a new idea, kind of like in academia, to be honest, if you present a new idea, that you will be awarded with the highest achievement, right? Like if Sikhism is so totally novel, right? As opposed to when these texts are being written, they're written in such a way that is striving for commonality. Like, look at the words they're using for Paramatma, right? For the divine. They're using Hari, they're using Ram, they're using Allah, they're using Parvatgar. These are Persian terms, Arabic terms, etc., right? And the previous were from Sanskrit, they're using Hindi, etc. And these are these are desiring, these are pushing forward commonality, right? You're bringing people in, right? It's not uncommon in the 18th century, 19th century that you had people of various communities. I mean, even recently, man, in London, you had, Qawwali singers at Gurdwara, right? And singing Shabads. And how beautiful a scene that was. You can't even imagine that. Most of those singers from either Mardana's lineage or Nusrat, for example. Nusrat was like denied at many Gurdwara because they all, Ota Muslim, he's Muslim. We're not going to allow him to speak here. You know, it's such a sad state that we've gotten to, um, because we've set up these, and it's a result of the mindset that has come out of the colonial period. It was a result of the Singh Sabha mindset that we are over here and we have nothing to do with anybody else, right? And it's so funny that you see that those people with those mentalities, right, who are so opposed to drawing commonality across Indic thought, across Islamic thought, those same people are saying, "Oh, you know what? Guru Nanak Dev Ji, he was very vibing with what Socrates or what these other esteemed people in the Western tradition, the Greek tradition, etc. Those traditions were saying, right? So they don't have a problem drawing commonality from across the world, right? But when it's coming to commonality with your neighbor, they're saying, "Oh, no, 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 no. Those are not our neighbors. Those are our enemies, essentially, right?" And that hinders, that kind of prevents our dive into Gurbani. And I was going to tell the students this as well in the course, is that if you have kind of a natural allergy to elements in the Indic tradition, I'll just tell you straight up, like, you're not going to enjoy Gurbani. You're just not going to enjoy Gurbani, man. You could read it and ignore all of those elements, and that's fine. And, to be honest, most of us do, right? But when you read it and you actually pay attention to what's happening, right? That all of these characters in Puranic cosmology are a part of this conversation, right? They're, for example, you read Sodar Tera Kya, like this. What can I speak about your door? Guru Nanak Dev Ji is writing about this kind of cosmic, or let's say this mythic landscape where Guru Nanak Dev Ji is at the divine's residence, right? And he's at the door. And what can I even forget about what he can say about divinity? Because there's nothing he can say about divinity, right? But what can I say about those people residing at the door? Gavat tudno Indra Indrasan Bekte. Like, you have all of these Indra, and you have all of these other cosmic Indic mythological deities who are there singing praise of the divine, right? And that's what I think we need to clarify when we're looking at these references, is that just the mere existence of these deities in the Vishnu, Shiv, etc., these Siddhs, Mahambal, all these great warriors, etc., of old, Yudhishthira, etc., all of these guys, they are seen as taking part in this, kind of divine devotional play, right? Guru Nanak Dev Ji is writing about them as being there and praising the divine, right? They're all singing the divine's praise. Again, they're not saying they are the divine. The mere existence of them for many people means that they're we are Hindu, that if we are going to include these characters, that we've bought into the system of Puranic mythology. And I would say that's not necessarily true. I would say that we are engaging with Puranic mythology. This is another aspect of my dissertation I write about, which will be public at some point. But the Suraj Prakash, Gaurabalas, Dasam Granth, Guru Granth Sahib, all of these texts are doing the same thing. They're engaging with Puranic mythology, right? With this meta narrative, drawing commonality with people so they can participate, right? So they feel comfortable, so they are included, right? You're building on top of these narrative structures which have existed in India for thousands of years, right? Which allows for this better reception of the ideas, right? You're including them, you're not excluding them, but they are taking part in what you're taking part in, right? Guru Nanak Dev Ji is stressing devotion. Well, it's talking about how Shiva, Vishnu, Brahma, Indra, all of these guys are being devotional to the divine, right? They're singing their praises at that door, at Sodar, right? And we're gonna say, oh, screw all these different deities. Like that's our focus, is to be like, oh, those don't exist. That's what we are gonna set up to say, like, our main kind of focus is on kind of cutting down other traditions, right? Whereas Guru Nanak Dev Ji was the bridge, right? He was bridging with other traditions, right? What is the point of him saying that? Is to say that, look, man, like you praise Vishnu, Vishnu's singing the praise of the divine. You praise Shiva, Shiva is praising it doesn't matter what tradition you're a part of, man. Just engage with these devotional, let's say bhakti, or engage in the cultivation of the good qualities. For example, this is outside of Jap Ji Sahib, but it represents this point and speaks to something we were talking about before, about these different darshanas, these different philosophies. When Guru Nanak writes, Sheikh Guru She Updes, Gur Eko Vesanek, this is in we recite in Sohela. It says, Baba, O wise one, Jayakar Kirat Hoy, if in that house where there is devotion, that place is where you're going to be taken care of. Like, you can be a part of whatever tradition, you have all of these different philosophies, 6 philosophies, like Sankhya, Yoga, Vedant, Visheshka, etc., all of these. But out of them, what's important is if there's devotion in that house, right? In that philosophy. If you have devotion in that philosophy, if you are, stressing nimrata, humility, etc. Like it says, like if you have bhakti and you have humility, if you have devotion and humility, like that's the door to devotion. It's not believing, and this is actually something that is going back to your point about Trump and kind of this Western influence, Christian influence, is that a lot of these things have become about belief. Do you believe in X, Y, and Z, right? If you believe, look at the SGPC, Rayat Maryada. What is to be a Sikh? It's just to believe, okay, I believe Guru Nanak, Guru Gobind Singh, I believe in Guru Granth Sahib, boom, bingo, bango, I'm a Sikh, right? And it's like, well, what does Guru Granth Sahib say about it, right? Guru Granth Sahib says, that a Sikh is one who wakes up in the morning, who does Amrit Vela, who does Bani, who and then goes to work and works hard, Kirat Kamai, etc., right? Having Paramatma on his lips all the time. You have actionable, ideas there, right? If you do this, then you can say that you are a Sikh, right? Otherwise, we're just, you know, what we are, man. We're just, by name, Naam Tariq Sikh.
Alright, quick update before we roll the bloopers. We only managed to tackle 4 out of about 12 or so questions for Dr. Jvala Singh in this session. So we didn't have enough time, and I didn't want to sprint through the rest of them and shortchange you, him, or myself. So we hit pause and we've scheduled a fresh recording to dig into the remaining questions slightly further on in the week. If you're enjoying these deep dives into history and philosophy, make sure to subscribe so that YouTube actually tells you when I post a video. Like the video so that it pushes the algorithm to share this with more people who might never have seen the video otherwise. As mentioned, if you want to get more behind the scenes content, early access, and other perks, consider joining our Patreon or becoming a YouTube member today. Your support keeps these conversations and videos going. Enjoy the outtakes and hopefully see you in part 2. No, completely. I remember doing talking about dissertations. I remember doing my dissertation, and one of my arguments was not for a PhD, although like that's a completely different ballgame. And like one of the points was basically Sikhi during the colonial period went from being orthopraxic, as you're saying, being practice based, to being orthodoxy, which is just I believe X, Y, and Z. Hence why we have all of these modern problems like who can have an Anant cottage and who can do this and who can do that. Before we get into it properly, how did the first course go? What was like the response like? How were people kind of taken to it?
I mean, the response was insane, man. I think like we had like 400 people sign up for that, right? So it was insane, the numbers. Right now we have about 150 for this one, which again is like way over. 100 is my goal, really, each time. And I think the response was interesting because like out of those 400, maybe only a quarter actually participated and did the readings and kind of maintained throughout the whole
Yeah.
course. Whereas like um I don't know, I expected a bit more, but I guess it's when people sign up to these, they don't know what to expect and life gets busy, like people don't have the time to like sit and actually do a whole course. So I get it.
Huh. Has that made you reconsider kind of the depth of reading and everything that you're going to provide in the course? Or are you still kind of like, well, no, there's a kind of a cut-off point for actually getting
This
the
yeah,
most out of it?
I think I don't want to reduce it because if I reduce it, if I make things easier, I don't think I'm doing anybody a favor. Like those people who are attending seriously, I want to give them their money's worth. So yeah, I don't feel like I need to reduce it. I think, those people who signed up enthusiastically and then life got in the way, they'll return
Yeah.
to it whenever like, um
Yes.
they have free time and stuff. Like yourself, I hope at some
Yeah,
point.
yeah, no. While you wait for part two, stick around for 5 minutes or a few minutes. While you wait for part two, stick around for some. Whilst you wait for part two, stick around for some unseen moments from before we hit record and a couple of my finest bloopers trying to nail this intro and outro. Today we're sitting down once again with Dr Jvala Singh, historian, linguist, and the mind behind a brand new course on Jap Ji Sahib. Among the many questions we explore, we ask with one deceptively simple yet explosive question. By the end of this conversation, by the end of this conversation,